Okay, we're officially recording as far as I'm aware. Okay, cool. We're gonna get right into this because I have like a lot of slides to talk about today when it comes to theory. Just sort of like ground rules. If at any point you have a question, if you can like raise your hand in Zoom or like do something to let Tanya know. Tanya, I'm just gonna trust that you're like watching that and you'll let me know when I need to stop or something. I'll be looking when I can, but you're on a different screen over here and the main thing is over here. Okay, you should take notes. That's part one. Part one is you should definitely take notes. And I obviously I'll give you folks the slides, like whatever. But I don't think that is in any way a replacement for you actually thinking about the stuff we're talking about. I don't know that you need to write down everything that's on these slides, but these are concepts I want you thinking about. So with that said, let's get into it. Okay, part one of this lecture, there are four parts to this lecture, is going to be about theory in general. So in this section, I'm just going to be giving you big picture stuff about theory as like a classification of arguments as opposed to any specific theory. Section one's on theory in general. Section two is on topicality. Section three is on conditionality. And section four is on specification arguments. So getting into theory in general. Okay, all of you are like at least relatively advanced debaters, so none of this should be new to you. But for anyone who's watching this in the future on Proteus or whatever, the general structure of every theory argument is identical. There are four parts to theory arguments, and those four parts are the interpretation, the violation, the standards, and the voters. The interpretation is the rule or definition you're trying to prescribe. In the context of topicality, you pick a word or a phrase and you provide an interpretation slash definition of that word. In the context of specification or conditionality, you establish that there is some sort of behavior the team must engage in or some sort of qualification for an argument or advocacy statement to be legitimate. Violation is where you indicate how they are violating, how they have deviated from the rule or from the definition you've described. Standards are why your interpretation is desirable. These are also frequently called reasons to prefer. I think I actually prefer thinking of them as reasons to prefer, but then the IVSV, I want some Vater thing doesn't work as well. And then voters are why this position rises to the level of a voting issue for your judge. And these kinds of always ends up being the same things. We established that this is an a priori voting issue, meaning that it's a gateway issue. If we win this, we win the debate. Fairness and education. That's like super quick because I assume all of you know this. I don't want to spend a bunch of time on this basic level thing. So now I want you to look at it how I tend to actually think about it, which is that, and I've mentioned this before, whether we're talking about a K, a theory, argument, whatever, everything in debate is either like a counterplan, a disad slash advantage, or framing arguments. And in this context, I find it helpful to think of the various elements of theory as serving specific functions in the context of like a disadvantage or counterclaim. So an interpretation is an attempt to generate uniqueness for a given model of debate. I.e., when we're reading standards, what we are arguing is that adopting a given model of debate allows us to generate specific internal links, which then generate offense in the form of the voter level issues of fairness and education, right? And that's going to matter when we get to concept number one in just a little bit. But bottom line, interpretations and counterinterpretations are basically plans and counterplans, right? They create uniqueness for the theory argument we're reading. In that sense, a violation is essentially you establishing a link into that model of debate, right? Like if you're reading a disad, the violation is link level. That may sound obvious to you, but I've talked to a lot of people about this over the years and they've had some challenges with it. Is that Jane raising her hand or stretching? Just stretch it. Got it. Okay, stay off camera, Jane. Establishes a link. It's all good. We have a lot of fun here. Standards, as I mentioned, are just internal links to fairness and education. Now, this is sort of like a pet peeve thing. You'll see some people in debate be like, the standard is education or the standard is fairness. That doesn't make any sense, right? Like those are the voting issues. Those are the impacts. Standards should establish why your interpretation provides the best form of education, the most fairness, et cetera, et cetera. And then voters, just keeping it simple, they're always the same things, a priori, fairness, and education, right? When we say a priori, we obviously mean gateway issue coming first, have to decide this first. Now, obviously, in the context of debating against K affirmatives, where we'd be reading something like long form framework, which like will kind of be baked into the T discussion here and the spec discussion here, you're going to have a debate, almost certainly, about whether you saying the words a priori means de facto you win the debate if you win theory, right? No KAF worth its salt is not going to have preamps, is not going to have justifications that try and indicate like the T shouldn't come first. We are an indite if that T, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We link turn education or impact turn it or fairness, whatever it might be. Now, a big part of winning those arguments against K's is obviously being able to describe why theory has to come first. And we'll discuss that in the context of things like procedural fairness and some other things. But bottom line, I think a lot of people, when they're newer, just say the word a priori and assume like, oh, cool, now we all agree and like we're good. I don't have to be able to defend that at all as like a model and approach to debate. You definitely need to be able to explain that if a team is reading a KF and if they have preamps or if that is a part of their strategy. If they don't do those things a little bit differently, the judge kind of knows the score. Just don't take this as for granted is all I would say. Any questions on that so far? Kind of simple stuff, but okay. Summary here, interpretations generate uniqueness. The violation is functionally a link. That's the only thing I really need you to focus on thus far. Okay. This brings us to our first exercise. Here's the exercise. They read an interpretation, a counter interpretation, technically. The negative may read conditional advocacies. They offer a standard for that interpretation. They call it theory proliferation. They say that absent the ability to be conditional, the neg will just read a ton of theory, which functionally lets them be conditional and crowds out substance, which decks education and fairness. Okay. I imagine any of you who've debated on the national circuit have seen this exact set of arguments read. If you've ever debated Berkeley, they've been saying this argument since 2015, and it continues to work for them, right? So my question for the class, sort of like Socratically here, and anyone can raise their hand or whatever, what is the issue here based on what we just established in discussing the function of interpretations, violations, standards, and voters? What is the issue? Adrian?
The standard is non-unique because the interp has nothing to do with like the nature of people being able to read theory.
100%. Okay. Ben, I assume you're going to say that. Obviously, Ben, we worked a little bit on the NPTE stuff during this, but yeah, 100%. So looking at this, right, we're going to get into concept number one. There's 10 concepts in this lecture. Okay. When I said concept, I was trying to focus on what are things I see happening in high level parley rounds that are bad or that are at a minimum exploitable from like a game theory perspective that we can, if we know a little bit more, take advantage of. So concept number one, and this is maybe the most important concept in this entire lecture. It's only offense if your interpretation resolves it. Standards, counter standards, etc., are only a reason to prefer your interpretation if your interpretation and only your interpretation solves for it. For those of you who don't know that, I mean, because again, a lot of debaters just kind of never kind of question things. The reason we call it uniqueness, like in disads or whatever, is because the principle is supposed to be this argument is unique to and only to a world where we maintain the status quo, do the counterplan, do the AF, etc. Right? And the same thing is true here. So what's the explanation? In that last exercise, the negative interp does not preclude the negative from reading as much theory as they want. It just lets them be condo and read as much theory as they want, right? Now, I have seen teams read this, again, since 2015, and I don't know that I have literally ever, especially at a national circuit tournament like, NPTE, NPA, ever seen anyone ever say this in a round. Like, not one time has this come up. So, sort of follow on to the exercise, if you're the negative team and you want to be condo because you're a sinner, what should your interpretation potentially say? How can you change your interpretation such that it is unique to and only to your model of debate?
Could we see the interp again?
Yeah.
Is it dispo being dispo?
Well, if you're the no, because in dispo you could still do the theory thing too.
Yeah.
So this is the interp. The negative may read conditional advocacies. How can you rewrite this interpretation so that you actually do solve for theory proliferation. Okay, kind of let you folks sit on that for a second. I'm just going to give you the answer, right? The negative may read conditional affixes when they read no more than one theory argument in the LOC. That inter gates the number of theory arguments that can be read, so it solves for theory proliferation while still allowing you to be conditional. Okay? There's a big takeaway here that is pretty easy to miss, but that I want to put into everyone's head, which is, in many instances, when we're writing counterinterpretations or interpretations, we need to think of it as a sort of grand bargain, okay? We give up X, they give up Y, okay? So in the context of this, the negative is saying, we will give up our ability to leverage multiple theoretical arguments, which would theoretically be potentially a good strategy for the negative, to check back for a lot of things, in exchange for the ability to read conditional affixes. And we think that balances the game. Like it's give and take. Similarly, when we'll talk about dispositionality later, that is the thesis of dispo. The thesis of being dispositional is the app gives up the ability to read theory and to read permutations in exchange for constraining the negative's ability to read conditional affixes. And so I think, generally speaking, it's a lot easier and potentially more compelling to explain to a judge, we're not just arbitrarily constraining the ability of the other team to read these arguments or whatever. We're trying to do it in a balanced way where we give up something and they give up something else, right? Now, obviously, are you still stacking the deck in your favor? Like, yeah, because like if you're the app and you know you're not going to go for the perm, you don't need theory, then it's just a no-cost situation. But perceptually and rhetorically, on the flow, it's going to look very different. Questions about this first concept. It's only offense if your interp resolves it. Okay. I'm going to stay for 1 second. Let's pretend instead they read a standard, and I saw this one recently, that's just like, critical education good. It's good for us to have critical education. We're the AF. We're reading KAF. You said we can't do that, but critical education's good. What would that sort of equivalent look like in this instance? Like, what's the argument? Does the interp resolve it? Does the interp not resolve it kind of situation? Like, how do you have to approach that? Well, let me rephrase that. What is the premise of the affirmative's argument as it pertains to uniqueness when they say we solve for critical education, or like our interp is good for critical education?
Like, what's the app's argument for why they're good for critical education?
Not so much why they're good for critical education, but why does their model of debate where they get to read a KF, and only their model of debate where they get to read a KF, solve for critical education? Or is there a problem with that idea? I'll make or go ahead, Adrian.
Or Ben can go since he
Ben, you can go. Ben, you were slightly slower, but yeah, Ben, I like a race, but
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think it's the same kind of argument, right? Like critical education doesn't have to just come from your critique or like not
the
debating
negative could read a critique. You could
Yeah.
read an advantage with critical framing. You could read critical framework and still defend the topic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? I really want you in your debate rounds this year, if nothing else, the reason this is like slide 2 or whatever, if nothing else, is to question whether the interpretation / counter interpretation that has been provided actually resolves the offense the other team is going for. Because in almost every instance I have ever seen, that's not the case. Teams have just gotten really good at reading their like 7 we get to read a K arguments really fast, and then they assume you won't go for framework because like no one ever answers those things, and then they just get to win the debate. Question whether the interpretation is sufficient. And when you write interpretations, do them in such a way that you resolve this issue. Be willing to take on the sort of grand bargain and exchange X for Y. Moving on. All right, go ahead, Christina.
Is this what people mean when they say this is a presumption trigger on theory? Like it doesn't change like the uniqueness?
When people say no, what people are doing when they say this is a presumption trigger is rhetorical sleight of hand. The only thing that's like actually a presumption trigger is if the affirmative team, well, it depends if, let's just pretend it's the affirmative for now. If counterclaims happen, it's different. Unconditional counterclaims at least. When they're reading presumption trigger, what they're saying is some argument, which doesn't make sense almost ever, means the things they're saying likely aren't true. And if they're not true, you should just pretend they didn't say anything at all and don't evaluate any of their arguments, right? There's a video from the year Amanda and Ryan won nationals, both nationals, where they read this argument in their KF that says something to the effect of like, we said, like basically the Western media and Western governments were able to pretend that there were nuclear weapons in Iraq, and that created like a reality where that was true to justify them going in and blah, 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 blah. And their argument was like, so since one time in one specific instance, something wasn't true, assume everything the app says or the NIG says, whatever, isn't true. That's a presumption trigger. It just doesn't make a whole ton of sense. The one that Berkeley used to read as well, or still sometimes reads, that's a little bit better, is this argument about truth testing, where they essentially say like any claim that we can't test because we're denied access to doing so for whatever reason, we can't clash with it, it's unpredictable, et cetera, should be presumptively evaluated as being false. Because like if it's, we can't prove a double negative, et cetera, right? Like if we weren't able to engage with it, there's no actual testing of this strategy and whether it's desirable. That's what a presumption trigger is. All of them are bad. Like almost every single one is bad. You would almost always be better off just making better arguments. With that said, it is minefield debate. If they don't answer the presumption trigger, the debate is over and you win. It takes 2 seconds to read a presumption trigger. It takes 4 seconds to answer one. So like it's really good value. It's just not actually a good argument. We good there, Christina?
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Next up, I want to talk to you about terrible interpretations people read all of the time in parliamentary debate, okay? And there's 4 that I have for you. Mostly because this slide had a cute, like 4, yeah. So number 1 is what I call the limits killer. This is where they say interpretation, only the AF is topical. Right? Now they could say it in those exact words, or they could say only endorsing the Black Hive is topical. Only endorsing a Maoist line is topical, whatever. The limits killer. Why do you think I call that the limits killer? Why is that the sort of silly name I've made for that argument? Ben.
It makes it so that they're the only there's only one topical half.
Exactly. They are trying to go for it. You read standards. You just said like limits are good. Let me just quote Pacific. The definition of limits post limits best because it allows us to understand the meaning of individual words going on within the resolution, thereby creating a focused debate. All that sentence said is most limits, best limits. They have now read an interp that is the most limiting possible. There is only one app that is allowed. They have now link turned all of your limits-based offense. We'll come to why that's dumb in just a minute. That's the limits killer. This happens all the time. Number 2, the permutation. Your interpretation plus RAF. So you may only derive options from the fiat topical, plain text endorsing the actor, blah, 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 and embrace the Maoist line. Why are they reading this? Go ahead, Sarah.
I think they're just reading it so they can get out of any offense that's tied to them and just include what they're doing. So it's like we're not breaking the rules, we're just including ours. So
yes, and in function, what is happening is the last one was we're link turning limits. This one is we're like 99.9% reading defense to limits because every app except for ours and your interpretation solves. We only add one more app than your interpretation. It's pretty much impossible for you to argue that one more app would be too much of a prepper. Okay, so this is another limits trick. We'll come back to why that's stupid in a couple slides. Number 3, AF in this instance, this is the die another day. AF in this instance and neg interpretation in every other round. Okay, so their interpretation is like we get to read the AF in this round, and in every other round, your interpretation that says you have to be topical, et cetera, should be the one we use. This is basically where people go like, well, they're trying to flip it on your head and say like, now you need to win that in this particular instance, it's necessary for us to do this thing because all those other rounds will solve. Any problems with that? Why does that seem silly? Question 1. Can your judge in this round dictate what will happen in all or any other parliament round? Of course not, right? There's no ability for the judge to solve for this specific instance of like, topic specific education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Secondarily, the fundamental premise here is basically that we can get policymaking topical education in every other round, so we should get K education in this round, right? Like if your goal is to solve for policy topical education, then all those other rounds will solve for it. What's the sort of other side of that coin? Ben?
It doesn't solve for like the specific abuse that happened in this round.
Sure, that's not a terrible argument, but what like when I say like the other side of the coin, right? Like they're saying we can get policy education in other rounds. What's like the most obvious possible answer to that?
So we're not getting any in this round?
Sure. And what's sort of the inverse though, right? Why can't we get K education in every other round? The problem with any theory argument that talks about other rounds is that all other rounds are inherently zero sum. If it is true that we could get more, topic specific education in other rounds, then it is also true we could get more K education in other rounds. So there's no actual offense being made. It doesn't actually solve for anything, in addition to the fact that the judge has no jurisdiction to be able to check back for that. Finally, the indefensible, as I call it, which is we get X amount of condo advocacies where X is greater than 1, maybe 2. But let me explain what I mean here. There is no, in my experience, I've literally never, ever, ever seen any team be able to explain why they need 3 conditional advocacies. I can't think of a single argument for why 3 is the number you need. Really, I can't think of great arguments for 2 condo, right? Like, why can't you defend this flow and your condo counter plan or your K, right? Like, arguments for why, well, we need K education and we need straight up education. Great. Well, status quo disad plus K solves for that. So you get that with 1 condo or with dispo, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The bottom line being that ignoring just condo, I think you should listen to people's interps and try and evaluate once again whether like if they specified like something hyper specific like a number or whatever, whether they actually have any standards or any meaningful defense of that number. Because let's pretend someone comes up and say, like, they're going to say, we get 3 conditional advocacies. Why wouldn't you just change your condo interp to be the negative is allowed 2 conditional advocacies? And then just argue that 2 is enough. Like, what could the argument actually possibly be that 3 is more necessary than 2? And you can do the same thing with 1 versus 2 and so on and so forth. But, like, you can solve 99.9% of their offense and make them actually try and justify that number. Questions about this? Cool. Concept number 2. Limits does not equal predictable limits. Limits does not equal predictable limits. People who say only the AF is topical to try and link turn all of your limits-based standards ignore that arbitrary limits are meaningless, okay? A limit is only useful insofar as it has a predictable basis. Now, I forgot to make a slide on this thing I'm about to discuss, so I'm just going to discuss it here. And thank God I'm here to discuss it instead of having someone else read this lecture. This is the distinction between the predictability of a interpretation and the predictability provided by an interpretation, which is yet another concept I never, ever, ever see teased out in debates. Let me explain what I mean. If we have a, let's pretend it's like a criminal justice topic, right? Some kind of like criminal justice reform, right? An interpretation that is from some random dude's blog that says criminal justice only includes these 3 things is very limited and would make it predictable if you knew that interpretation ahead of time, because you would know there's only 3 possible things they can do, and therefore I can prepare for them. But the problem is that interpretation in and of itself is not predictable. It just produces predictability post-fact, okay? You would never assume that some random blog would be the standard for how we're going to decide what is and what is without the topic. Conversely, A definition of criminal justice from the Supreme Court that includes 800 things is way more predictable of a interpretation, but provides way less predictability in and of itself. So you need to be able to draw this distinction and argue, why is it better to use some random dude's blog thing that limits it to 3, and why is 3 debates enough flexibility for the affirmative but still allows for negative engagement? Or the opposite, why should we debate things in the context of what is most accurate, what is most field contextual, most important, most likely to be what the sort of topic writer intended, et cetera, even if that means there's a much harder debate for the negative because there's a million possible paths. Predictability of an interpretation is that the interpretation itself is one you could have guessed. Predictability produced by is that if you knew the interpretation ahead of time, it would have been useful. So when they say only the AF is topical, sure, that produces a very predictable, limited set of debates if you knew that interpretation, but there's no reason why a negative in prep before the debate, especially in Parley with 20 minutes, would ever come to the decision that this falls within the bounds of the topic. It's fundamentally arbitrary. Questions about this? Okay. Concept number 3. Other rounds are zero sum. I already explained this, so we're just going to stay here for a second. Any argument about how doing X in other rounds solves makes no sense because other rounds are zero sum. If we can get K education, we can get policy education. Other rounds are other rounds. The judge has no control over them. Don't let teams get away with reading interpretations of this. Example, they say we can get policy education in other rounds. You just say, but that's also true of critical education. Very simple, but again, something teams get away with. If the judge, go ahead, Adrian.
Yeah, I was just curious how this interacts with a lot of arguments about like norm setting and how interps impact other rounds.
We're going to have a slide on that. The answer is that you can, so a concept we will talk about a little bit that is not discussed in Parley, but is more prevalent in policy, especially like high school policy, is this idea of like judge instruction as a category of arguments, right? Like this is somewhat distinct from like a framing argument, but you can just explain that like our interpretation, we're not arguing that in every round ever, this is how the debate should play out. We're arguing that in this particular instance, it should play out this way. Now, obviously, there's a set of arguments that say that's bad, but for instance, if we have an interpretation that's like, I'm trying to think. Give me 1 second to think of an example because I don't have one off the top of my head. Defense, okay, like defense, whatever, right? And we define that word to mean like defense is when a football team is trying to stop the other team from scoring, and it's a resolution about football defenses. That's a really good interpretation. And if you came up as the other team and you were like, yeah, but if we were talking about the Department of Defense, that would make no sense and be stupid. It's like, well, yeah, because we're not talking about the Department of Defense. We're arguing in the context of this round. Now, comparatively, in some instances, it's much more to your favor to say no in every debate. It should play out this way, right? I'm not saying that either side of pretty much any of these questions is correct. I want you to be aware of the set of arguments in favor of either side so that you can use that to your favor. Okay. Concept 4, and then we're going to take a break from concepts, I think. In the history of debate, no one has ever explained why they need X number of conditional advocacies. Okay, I mentioned this earlier. Teams inherently just say whatever number of advocacies they read, but are never ready to defend why that specific number is necessary when that number is greater than 1. You should use that to your advantage when writing interps. Again, this could be as simple as saying they get 2 condo when they read 3. Adrian, what is your favorite one of the dinosaurs? Well, which one do you like?
Like on the screen?
Yeah.
I really like the little red what's that? Stegosaurus?
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, cool. Just see some writing. Okay, I'm gonna move on in a second. Obviously, you'll have the video of this and all this stuff. Bold part's much more important on all of these slides. Now we're going to talk about topicality. Remember, that was all just theory in general. There's going to be like 15 slides on topicality, okay? First things first, there are 3 kinds of topicality. You should understand them. You should understand how to deploy them. Topicality in general is just the AF did not meet their burden of defending the resolution. Extra topicality, which tends to be explained in the context of a violation, sometimes as an interpretation, is that the AF does defend a topical action, but they also go beyond that. So if the resolution was that USFG should establish a universal basic income, extra topicality would be like the USFG should establish a UBI and give everyone a puppy. Like obviously giving everyone a puppy was not included in the resolution. Effects topicality is that the plan is not topical in a vacuum, but the effects of the plan result in a topical action. So if the resolution was end arms sales to Israel, and the plan was the US should stop manufacturing arms, in effect, that would likely result in us no longer selling weapons to Israel. So that is topical in its effects. But obviously, stopping manufacturing of arms in and of itself is not topical. Now, you could also argue that this specific plan text is extra topical because it goes beyond the resolution and does et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I tend to think it's best to read an interpretation and then read a violation about effects and extra topicality. But back in the day, we very much used to just read like interpretations for extra topicality that were like the affirmative may only defend topical plan action limited to the resolution or whatever. Or the plan in a vacuum must result in a topical action for effects. So why are these bad? Well, topicality is obvious, so let's talk about effects and extra. The reason that effects topicality is uniquely bad is because it justifies actions outside of the topic that allow them to skirt links since there's no direct topical action. Your disad, if you're writing, a disad in general, is probably going to have a specific link that the topical mechanism, i.e. ending arms sales, causes some bad thing to happen. But if they get layers of obfuscation where they do something that causes something that causes something that causes something that then gets rid of arms sales, like perception links, etc., those things go out the window because we're not doing the thing that they said would be perceived in this way. Now, with banning arms sales versus like getting rid of guns, you might be like, yeah, but those perceptions are the same. But like, let's just pretend instead, like they're like, the plan is we should elect only democratic socialists to Congress. It's like, okay, well, that probably will ultimately result in us not supporting Israel anymore. And there's definitely a difference in the perception link in that instance. Extra topicality is bad because it literally justifies the app generating ground off of anything they want. The way that I've always explained this to judges is they get to add words to the resolution, which is inherently the single most unpredictable thing they could do and the single most exploitative thing for their ground. We're going to talk about a concept later, quantity of ground versus quality of ground. But here's the thing. No team that is extra topical and is any good would ever pick ground that is not just crazy biased in their favor, right? Like what would be the benefit of like, we're going to give them a UBI and kill every third child? Like that's extra topical and terrible. They don't do that. They always do like, we're going to give them UBI and everyone gets a puppy or ice cream or yummy yummies, whatever they are. So, moving on. Answering topicality. I've told this to the DVC kids. I know the Pacific kids probably have something similar because Steve taught me and that's what I used. But for people watching this who aren't from there, and Adrian and Jasper, because Jasper didn't know this when I talked to them like a week ago, these are the 6 arguments you should be making against every topicality argument in the context of Hartley. I also think in the context of like all formats of debate, this is probably a good roadmap, but it depends because obviously in LD, they'll read T in like 30 seconds and you have 1 minute. It's kind of hard to make 6 arguments sometimes, whatever. The first argument you make should always be a we meet or an impossible to meet. You should then read a counter interpretation that you meet and potentially explain that you meet that interpretation. You then want to, on the standards level, read an advantage to your interpretation, what I call R's good. Then you should read a disadvantage or offense against their interpretation, yours bad. Then you should say, don't vote on potential abuse. And then you should say this should be evaluated through reasonability, and we'll talk a lot about reasonability later. But bottom line, we meet, counter-interpret that you meet, our interpretation is good, your interpretation is bad, don't vote on potential abuse, reasonability. When I first started learning the MG, I literally, I will, maybe someday I'll tell you folks about this who I haven't already, but at like DVC, like we use like a one sheet, right? Where if you're the MG, you have a sheet of paper that is not your flow. It's completely separate from your flow. That you write like, here's all my T definitions, here's my K blocks, here's my thumpers, here's whatever, so on and so forth. And I would literally just have WMCI, WMCI, OG, YB. And as I was answering T, I would literally check them off just so that I knew I checked it until I got it down pat. Question based on like the second slide we had or whatever. What is a we meet in function? What is the function in debate of a we meet argument? What is it doing? Adrian?
Is it a non-unique?
No.
It's a no link, right?
It is a no link. Remember, the violation was a link. A we meet is therefore a no link. What is a counter interpretation? What is it doing?
Giving you offense, right?
What do you mean by giving you offense? You're in the right direction, but what specifically does it do?
You're able to. Ooh.
Why do we read a counterplan? If the app's reading, go ahead, Ben, if you want to answer before my question.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think it like solves the offense of their
Yes.
interpretation and
It's
maybe a net benefit.
It's just like a counterplan. You read it to steal as much of their offense as possible and have an external net benefit for why yours is desirable, which is to say it generates uniqueness. You are generating uniqueness to tie into their offense and to generate your own offense. Very important concepts. Ben, you still have a question or your hand's just on?
Sorry.
Okay. That's my favorite dinosaur, by the way, that one. I like that one. Okay. 3 kinds of definitions. This is probably the least useful slide in this entire PowerPoint, but it's smart, and that could be useful. There's actually 3 kinds of definitions that are broadly understood, and this could be useful in the context of you explaining T. DVC for years, and Pacific back when I was there, had a block in our T shells on words in the resolution that were common, so like the United States, etc., that talks to this. But basically, there's 3 kinds of definitions: primitive, ostensive, and formal. Formal is what you're thinking of when you hear the word definition. It's like a dictionary definition. It has clear intent to define. It intends to include the elements that are relevant and exclude the ones that are not. Now, the 2 you're probably not familiar with are primitive definitions and ostensive definitions. So primitive definitions is where we just basically don't even bother defining the word because they're so commonly understood. No one ever asks you to define what a rock is. We all sort of get it. Like, no one's like, oh, when I said rock, I meant like an igneous or sedimentary or et cetera. Like, no, it's a rock, dude. Then there's ostensive. And ostensive is definition via example. And this is how we teach kids, right? So they see a doggy and we say doggy. And they're like, okay, doggy. And then they see a goat or like whatever later on and they say doggy. And we go, no, Jack, you idiot, that's a goat. Okay, so it's pointing to things that are examples of topical. You see this in debate. It's never used in this way, but that's kind of in function what a TVA is, right? Like you're trying to say, like, here is an example of something that would meet our interpretation via this definition. You also see this in a lot of like legal, so this is more of an LD thing, so it doesn't have a ton of parley, but like when there's definitions associated with like legal cases, they'll like define like this is included, and this is included specifically, right? Like these kinds of things are examples of it. This also comes back to like the classic example from when I think it was a case about like pornography, but they were basically defining like what is obscenity law and what is not obscene. And there's like this famous judge who basically said like, well, I know it when I see it. I got it, and that's essentially what you're saying with ostensive. Ostensive can be paired with sort of reasonability analysis, right? But like, this is part of this category of things. Same thing with primitive. Okay. Concept number 5. There are really only like 3 standards for T. Everything else is kind of nonsense or just a more specific version of these 3 things. There's 2 standards for the AF, and there's 2 standards for the neg. Guesses for what those standards are for the AF and what those standards are for the neg.
Neg is lit base, creativity, and bright line.
Neg is creativity?
Yeah, I think that's what we read.
Isn't it? Why would the negative say it's good for the AF to be creative?
Oh, you mean like responding?
Well, so when you're the negative and you're reading T, what do your standards say?
I thought they were creativity, bright
It's
line,
limits,
and lit
limits
base.
and field context.
Limits and field context.
Oh,
Neg always says,
I
ideally,
that's my
predictable
bad.
limits and field context, right? The idea being that we need a limited amount of things that we have to prepare for, and we need those things to have a predictable, non-arbitrary basis. That basis is always derived from the resolution. The resolution is the only stable locus of offense that both teams have access to prior to the round. And then field context, which is just like, also, we're just kind of right on this, like the experts agree, it's most specific, etc. What does the affirmative say in response to that? What are their 2 standards? I'll give you a hint. One of them is also field context. But what's the other one? You're the AF. They said you should be really limited. What do you say?
Afflex.
Affirmative flexibility / creativity. Okay, the AF wants to say, we need a sufficient amount of wiggle room. We need the opportunity to be creative and not just engage in the same old debate. Also field context. That's it. I think every other standard on T is basically nonsense. When people say critical education, they're really just saying creativity and also not able to solve for it. Now, the reason that I think neg teams are somewhat advantaged on legitimate topicality arguments, legitimate being a weird way of phrasing that, is because I almost think to a certain degree the creativity debate actually flows negative, because there's a really solid set of arguments that are like, the best thing for creativity is a constraint, right? Like, the reason we get the iPhone isn't because we say just make anything. It's because we say, I want to be able to call people, access the internet, and have all of my songs in my pocket. It can only cost this much and it needs to be this big. Like, that forces you to be creative, right? Iron Man in the cave versus Tony Stark when he's like in his laboratory or whatever, right? Like, he's got to be creative and make the Iron Man suit because he has the constraints of the environment he's been put into. Everything else is the same. Already mentioned that. We're going to roll. Okay, now we're going to get into a bunch of slides that are just A and B, A and B, A and B. This versus this. Arguments, sort of both sides of the debate. Let's talk about the distinction between limits and predictable limits. I think you should only ever be talking about predictable limits, and I'll explain why. The premise of limits is the interpretation that limits most, limits best. The app should have as few options as possible because that is the best way for the negative to be able to engage. The problem with that is what we talked about earlier. What if the app says counterinterpretation, only one thing? Well, now they've link turned your limits offense. They're way more limiting than you were. That's why instead we should always be framing our limits as predictable limits. Limits are only functional insofar as they generate predictable ground for the negative, and the only way that happens is they're based in the resolution and are non-arbitrary. What does arbitrary mean? I use that word a lot when I'm talking about theory. What does arbitrary mean, someone? Like in your own words.
It's like subjective.
I think the best way of thinking about it in this context arbitrary is without reason, right? Without justification. Like, just having some limit for the sake of having a limit, not having that limit be based in anything that like was reasonably, basically the way I think of limits is it's about the negative's ability to prepare for possible affirmative strategies. And obviously the thing that dictates that primarily is the resolution and the sort of social contract that both teams will debate that resolution. Now, what are good K teams going to do? Well, they're going to argue that we are debating the resolution, or we're resolutional adjacent, or we're in the direction of the resolution, and so on and so forth. And if you're the negative, you need to stick to your guns and be like, none of that counts. It's all, you're the top player. Next, this or that. Accuracy versus division of ground. Todd Graham and I think Brandon Merrill from SIU wrote a paper on this that you can still find on the old NPDA journal. But they argued that topicality is not about division of ground. It's actually about accuracy. I.e., topicality isn't about providing the af and neg and equitable distribution of ground. It's about debating the content that was intended. If the word rare earth minerals only refers to, I forget the exact thing, but it's like the like lanthanide series and these 6 things, whatever it actually is, it doesn't matter that that significantly constrains the affirmative's topical options because that is what the word means. Like, we're not having the debate if we're not debating it in that way. Rare earth minerals is not a term of art. It was defined by the organization that makes the periodic table. There is a right answer here, and we should debate that no matter how good or bad it is for the af or the negative. Now, in the majority of instances, people understand topicality to instead be about a division of ground. That we're establishing a division of ground that allows both sides to prepare and facilitate clash, right? To facilitate the debate to occur. This understanding could be very useful when we're talking about critical education standards, right? Because we're not saying there can't be room for critical education in the debate. We're just saying that that falls on the negative sort of side of the division of ground as opposed to the affirmative. I have seen this used like once ever. I used to use this all the time. This was me and Dallas's trick, right? Because we wouldn't set up that it was accuracy or division of ground in the LOC, but then based on how they answered it, if they were like, here's a bunch of ground standards, we would pivot to, oh, no, this was never about ground. It was always about accuracy. And vice versa. If they were making arguments for why they're just the most right field contextually, we'd be like, we don't care what the field context is. We care if the negative can engage, and here's the reasons why we can't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We need a more limiting interpretation. Never comes up, could very easily win UT debates. Floor versus ceiling. This is like a Brenna and Tristan like favorite, something that they use quite effectively over the years. I think they might have even done this in the NPDA finals from 2024. Floor versus ceiling is the argument that in the case of floor, our interp establishes a minimum action necessary for the af to be topical. So this tends to come up if like the definition's like military presence. So think about the LD topic. If your definition is military presence must include boots on the ground. It only counts if you send in troops. You can send in tanks, you can send in airplanes, but you must send in troops to be deployed on the ground. That's a floor. Ceiling is a maximum. So this is about intent to exclude things. So you say military presence is aircraft and watercraft, and in doing so, you exclude things that aren't those two things. You should be able to argue why an interpretation that sets a floor is preferable to one that sets a ceiling, and why one that sets a ceiling is preferable to one that sets a floor. Floors are good because it guarantees some negative engagement because we're always going to get at least this specific link. Ceilings are good for affirmative or negative engagement because it constrains the possible number of things available, and limiting that set of things is good. It prevents an overabundance of affirmative flexibility, etc. And again, I'm moving a little faster here, so if you need me to slow down or anything, let me know. Potential versus proven abuse. I've heard a number of students use these terms and not actually have sort of interrogated what they mean. Potential abuse is the af interps or whoever's interp justifies them doing X, whether they did that or not, they are creating a bad model of debate. So we're not saying you actually did do the cheater thing, but we are arguing that your model of debate would allow you to do so, and therefore it's bad. This ties into a concept we discussed earlier because there's a flaw to this approach. What is it? What concept did we learn earlier that would argue that this is a flawed way of thinking about theory and debate? Adrian?
The judge can't verify what goes on in other rounds.
Zero sum, right? This is the zero sum thing. Other rounds, we have no control over other rounds, right? So the fact that someone could have been a jerk, why would you ever vote us down for something we didn't actually do? The way Pacific's been saying this for like 20 years is it'd be like voting on potential abuse is like voting on a potential disapp. Like if they didn't read the diss ad, why would you give them credence for it? Now, again, you would need some judge instruction to be able to explain argument is about the reason you should evaluate T as a model of debate is this. The reason you shouldn't is this. Proven abuse is just the AF or the neg actually did the bad thing that their interp justifies. Now, where is potential abuse a little more potentially reasonable and isn't about other rounds? Condo, right? Because they can say we're conditional, but then still go for the counterclaim. Is that proven abuse or potential abuse? Well, they were condo, but they didn't remove it unilaterally from the debate, which is what most of our standards were about. So it's technically potential abuse. However, you can obviously argue that it skewed the MG strategy, and that was proven abuse, right? Sure, they didn't actually kick it, but it changed how we had to approach the debate because we had to assume multiple states of uniqueness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes there's not a clear bright line between these two things. Okay. Depth versus breadth. Depth is the argument that interpretations that limit the possible number of things ensure we have an in-depth discussion of the things that are allowed. This is generally a negative argument, that we should have a discussion on a small subset of things to a greater level of depth. Breadth instead says interps that ensure we exhaust the possible issues on a given topic rather than only focusing on a few are more desirable, which is obviously typically an AF argument, right? That there's a lot of things that could fall into the topic, and it's good to understand and survey all of those things rather than limiting it. This is also the KF standard, right? Ks want to argue that when we engage with a resolution, the sort of pedagogical or research approach that we're engaging with shouldn't just be this narrow one filtered through a policymaking framework, but instead should attack the topic from a variety of areas. Rhizomatically. Shout out to Adrian. Another one, Brent, interesting you like to use a lot. Quantity versus quality of grounds. This tends to, well, I'll just read it. So quantity. Typically, this is an extra topicality argument for the AF that says we actually increase negative ground since there are more things to generate links to. Quality argues that the only thing that matters is whether the ground we were given is of a sufficient quality. This is usually rooted in things like predictability and stability. So we had this theory exercise we were all doing the other day, right? Where the interpretation was like, plan text must include this. It's not enough to just have it in the solvency block. That's sort of this argument about quality and stability, right? Well, if it's not in the plan text, then it's not a stable source of offense for us because we are not guaranteed links to it throughout the debate. We can jettison this in XYZ way, etc. Now, is the affirmative right that like there's a greater quantity of ground when you're extra topical? Sure. But as we mentioned earlier, they will only pick the best possible ground, the best quality of ground. So they're going to stomp our guts out. Okay. Procedural versus discretionary fairness. This honestly probably should be its own concept because it's so important. So I really want you to hone on this. There is a distinction between procedural and discretionary fairness. Procedural fairness is fairness that is a product of established procedure. So the best kind of metaphor I can give you here is like your Miranda rights when a cop arrests you. It doesn't matter what cop it is, what state you're in, they are required by federal law to have a procedure wherein they read you your rights when you are arrested. And if they're not, it can sort of influence the ability for certain evidence to be used and admitted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Discretionary fairness is just like the AF has deigned to award you search and ground. So this is like an individual cop who lets you off with a warning when you're speeding. There's not a set of procedures that govern this. They're just incidentally, in this particular instance, deciding that you should be allowed to do it. How else does this factor in? There's a distinction, as we'll talk about in just a second, between in-round and out-of-round fairness that is very closely tied to this. We'll come back to that shortly, though. Model of debate versus particular instance. We've kind of been alluding to this a lot, right? Model of debate is where you argue that the interp sets a model for all debates, not just the one that we're currently in. Particular instance is arguing that this interp is about this specific round, so it doesn't really matter if it works in some other round, because again, those rounds are all zero-sum. I also want to make it clear that other than sort of like the predictable limit stuff and like writing better interps, most of this, if you're the negative, doesn't really need to happen till the block. Like you don't need to in your interpretation be like, and also we're defending this from the perspective of a model of debate. Similar to how you don't necessarily need to say evaluate the competing interpretations in the LOC. In-round versus out-of-round fairness. This should have been moved up one slide. My bad. In-round fairness is obviously fairness in the context of this particular debate. It is closely associated with rules and procedures of debate, right? So there's something about debate as an activity that in the rules of that debate that guarantees certain amounts of fairness, right? So in some formats, we have equal speaking times, right? We have an equal number of speeches. In some formats, in most formats, because the app gets the first and last word, we give the negative a block to try and rectify that balance by making the last app speech really short and giving the block a really big period of time. These are all procedures which help govern in-round fairness. Now, out-of-round fairness is fairness issues associated with our broader society rather than as a function of debate as an activity. So this happens a lot in K debate, right? Where it's like, well, fairness is never promised to the body of color or whatever it might be in this particular instance, or the disabled body or whatever it is. And it's like, that's totally true, but that's obviously not a function of debate necessarily. Now, debate certainly can be racist, things like that. I think if you were to like, I don't know if there's like a equity meter somewhere, I think debate might be about as close to the most like equitable in terms of like being accepting of people from different walks of life and all that kind of stuff thing that exists anywhere in like competitive activity. And so the idea here being that people will always recognize it's like, well, fairness is terminally non-unique, or like fairness is relevant because there's different budgeting and there's different coaching and there's different whatever. And it's like all of those things being true is not a reason why we shouldn't have a set of procedures that guarantees fairness to everyone participating in the activity in the context of the round. And in fact, it can be argued that that just begs uniqueness for establishing procedural fairness, right? If the rest of the world is so shitty, then let's guarantee in this space we establish procedures that are equitable and inclusive of people. Okay. Same slide twice. Gross. Oh, we gotta start the whole video over. Sorry, folks. Just kidding. Intent to define. Intent to define is the idea, I mentioned this earlier, but I should have defined it. Intent to define is the idea that the interp being used for a word is actually from a definitional source. Okay? So this is more relevant in evidentiary formats of debate rather than parley. But for instance, a dictionary or legal case definition where they actually are trying to define a concept is a lot better in theory than just like some random thing that debaters highlighted down to try and say some words. A classic example of this, I forget the card. Is it Brown 83 or Brown 93, whatever it is? It's the card that says like, it's about insurance policy. And I think it says like, reduce includes zero or increase includes zero, something to that effect, right? Where like in the context of this law, what they were saying is in order for an insurance benefit to increase, it must exist prior to that. That's what it is. It's increase. And it's like increase, you can't create something new. You have to have something that already is there and then make that bigger. So like if you were saying like increase restrictions on policing, you can't create a new restriction. You have to increase the restrictions that already exist. So like taking away more weapons or whatever it might be. We're finally on to condo. Conditionality. It's much shorter and specs even shorter than this. But condo, let's keep it really short. You should just read Dispo instead, okay? It solves all their offense in like 99% of instances, especially in Parley. This might be different in LD. In Parley, the answers that people are reading against Condo, every single one of them just about, and I've looked at this with the Pacific Kids, with Berkeley stuff, like Berkeley's probably the number one team that's been answering Condo for a long time. All of their answers are solved by Dispo, okay? What is dispositionality? It's an interp that says the negative may not read conditional advocacies. That's it. Interpretation, the negative may not read conditional advocacies. That is distinct from condo bad. Now, you should not label your argument as condo bad or dispo. You should just start reading and be like, interpretation, the negative may not read conditional advocacies. Why? Because they're going to answer it like you just said, condo bad. So they're going to say it's important that we get to read multiple things. It's important that we have some ability to wiggle out of arguments, blah, 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 blah. But Dispo solves all of that. Why does Paul like this? Because it's really just a trick. Our interp lets the negative be dispo. We didn't say they have to be dispo. We said they can't be condo. That means they can still read multiple advocacies, which will solve all of their offense. Every reason people read for why they need to be condo is their ability to read multiple advocacies and potentially to jettison arguments. Dispo lets you read multiple arguments and potentially lets you remove them from the debate. So if you're sitting there and you're like, I still don't really know what Paul means by dispo, like what is dispo? How do we answer that? Like if I ask them what the status is and they say dispositional, do I just trust them? Absolutely not. What is dispo? Dispositional means one thing and one thing only, okay? This started being a thing in like 1983 or whatever in a policy debate from the University of Kentucky. There's an article about it. I can link to it if you want it. Dispositional means the negative can kick advocacies when the AF reads theory that isn't about the status of an advocacy or a permutation. So if the AF reads like spec, you can kick the advocacy. If the AF reads a perm, you can kick the advocacy. If the AF reads condo, you cannot kick the advocacy. This is another one of those grand bargains we talked about earlier. It's reciprocal. It offers a constraint on both affirmative and negative strategy. We give up the perm and we give up, theory, like especially against K debates or something like that, right? Like you could be A-spec against K or whatever you wanted to, or like they can't figure out evolutionary potential. We're giving up all of those great strategies to constrain your ability to jettison arguments. Why is condo bad? You don't have to agree with me, but anyone have thoughts? Why? I actually only think there's one reason condo is bad. Like I think it's very simple, and everything else is nonsense. Does anyone have any guesses as to why I think condo is bad? Specifically condo, not dispo. What makes condo problematic and dispo not problematic? Ben?
Isn't it a question of like AF choice versus neg choice? Like it lets
100%. It is condo is bad because it's the only thing in debate that allows a team to unilaterally remove arguments from the debate. If I read a turn on your disad and you don't answer it, I win the debate. If I read an RVI, even though those are stupid, on your theory and you don't answer it, I win the debate, in theory. Condo lets me read literally I could have 2 minutes of the single greatest responses to a counterplan or K ever, the most in-depth, educational, transcendental, like incredible arguments, and then you get to go not going for it, and all of it goes away. That's stupid and bad. That objectively advantages the negative in a way that the affirmative has no equivalent to. Concept 6. When you read dispo as your interp, the only offense against it is that the ability to unilaterally remove advocacies from the debate is desirable / necessary. Anything else is not offense. Anything about reading multiple things, anything about allowing K and policy education, anything about theory proliferation, none of that is offense. Dispo deals with all of that. The only thing that is different between condo and dispo is that the affirmative gets a say in whether you can kick the argument or not. Why is it bad for you to be able to unilaterally remove arguments from the debate? It's because it's so damn efficient. Debate is a game balanced around time and executing arguments as efficiently as possible given time. Your job is to create time trade-offs. I want to read T in 1 minute and have them take 2 minutes to answer that topic out. I'm trying to create a time trade-off. Condo guarantees they win a time trade-off. Because if you spend 1 minute even and you're the most efficient ever, they can still kick it, right? So they can read their counter plan in 10 seconds, 20 seconds, whatever. If it's K, it's going to take longer, obviously. And then they can kick it, and they've stolen all that time back from you. If you spend 3 minutes, they're going to kick it. And it creates this perverse incentive where the better your arguments are, the more likely they are to not matter in the debate. Even if you only read offense. They just get to remove it from the debate unilaterally. That's going to create a time trade-off. And then the other thing is this double-edged sword where either you can answer the argument really, really well so that they can't go for it, or you can be like, well, I'm going to answer it just okay so that I have time to deal with all these other things. And now they've influenced the MG strategy in such a way that you could have answered it better, but they forced your hand because they knew they could kick out of it or not kick out of it, and you had no say. You don't need to write the second part down. I've already explained it. The fundamental difference between condo and dispo is just AF choice versus neg choice. Dispo says the AF gets a say in whether an argument can be removed, and in doing so, gives up 2 lines of strategies. Okay. Adrian?
What exactly do teams mean when someone says they're dispo and the other team asks what your disposition is?
So here's the thing. People in Parley didn't do policy debate or didn't follow the historical development of theory arguments by and large. And so when they say what's the disposition, that question makes no sense. Dispo only means one thing, right? What they're trying to say is some teams would be like, we're dispo, and the disposition is we can kick it if you do this or this or this. And what teams will do is be like, oh, we're dispo, but we can kick it if you read defense or offense against it. So you're condo. Like, you know what I mean? Like, they're really just trying to do rhetorical sleight of hand. Dispositional only means one thing, which is why you should ask them, what's the status? If they say dispo, you should ask them, what do you think that means? And then have them answer it. And then you should be able to explain at the top of the MO, or I guess the top of the PMR, that's not what dispo means. Here's why the dispositional only means one thing. It's based on this, blah, 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 blah. Here's why that's different. It's after choice versus neg choice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now it solves all their offense. Okay. So just for instance, you'll debate Rice. Rice is this thing where they're like, we can kick it if we resolve all of the offense. That's not dispo. Right? Like, that is a pretty good interp and pretty reasonable interp. And in those debates, like, I would potentially argue you shouldn't go for condo. But it's easy to overcome if you know what you're doing. Concept 7. Format-specific uniqueness can help you argue the condo flow should be evaluated as a question of necessity rather than benefit. This is something that DVC has had in their theory shells for a long time. But basically, my position is, if in your format there is a significant, or even really any, but significant structural side bias in favor of the negative, i.e., at the top tournaments, the negative consistently has a higher win rate, then in my opinion, you should try and argue that it's not enough for the neg to say condo would be good for them. They should have to win that condo was a necessity, i.e., they can't engage in the debate absent this. So example, in Parley at Nats this year, there was a massive negative side bias at the NPTE and also the NPTA as far as I'm aware. And at the NPTE, the AF gets months to prep the AF. So AFs that were fully prepared, ready for the K, second lines ready, all of that stuff, still got their asses whooped by the negative. If the format is favoring the negative, they shouldn't just get to say condo helps the neg. They should have to argue that the neg needs to be condo because otherwise they're just exacerbating a structural side bias. Why does the negative need more tools if they're already winning the majority of the debates? This is a little spike I like to sneak in there. If they don't answer it, you basically just win. And I think to answer it is somewhat difficult. Like, obviously there's some arguments where it's like, well, maybe the reason they're winning so much is because of condo, or maybe like it's like a brink argument and like condo wouldn't be enough to rectify the bias, right? But then obviously it's the AF, you'd go for like try or die, moving in the direction of equity is still better than making it worse. Okay. Spec, the last part of this lecture. Spec is short for specification. Concept number 8, I think this is all this says. Judges overwhelmingly dislike spec. Okay, everyone but our dear friend Alan Fishman dislikes spec. Okay, all of them. No one wants to vote on spec. No one, especially over the age of 30, wants to vote on spec. So anytime you read spec, you should do so either to create a time trade-off and not have to go for it, or because the DV did something egregious or you know your judge is a spec hack. You would be stupid not to read spec in front of a judge like, Alan or whoever that's into spec. Like, it's advantageous. You should adapt. But overwhelmingly, people dislike spec and don't want to vote on it. That's primarily because like the infinitely regressive stuff's pretty good against that. Here's a bunch of types of spec. I'm leaving out a number of them because they're all stupid. These are the kind of acceptable specs. actor specification, which is A spec, enforcement specification, which is E spec, over specification, which is O spec, vagueness, which is like under specification, and everything else is dumb. F spec, almost always dumb. Okay, they just get to fiat it. Who cares? You don't get to defund the F-35 Lightning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are the various kinds of spec. You should be aware that they exist. I think actor specification and enforcement specification can be very winnable, but it depends on the resolution, right? Like if there's a resolution, Whitman has been making a killing off of A spec and E spec without labeling it as such the last two nationals, right? Like they will find, anytime there's a resolution, they'll try and find, well, there's two bodies that could do this technically. And so they'll read spec saying you had to pick the other one, whichever one you did pick. Or if you don't specify, they're like, well, that changes the day because we should have been guaranteed ground on this or that, etc. That also comes up a lot with like treaty topics because obviously inherently a treaty has two sides to the treaty. And so like, who does it? Is it the AF, or the Americans, or the the Russians, or whoever? Who comes to the team? I like A spec and E spec and vagueness against the K. I don't think that's the best strat in the world, but I think it's a tool you should have in your toolbox. You should be willing to do. I think most K teams aren't ready to throw down on like we not having an actor is fine for whatever reason, right? It's like kind of hard to evaluate. Okay. Let's talk about reasonability versus competing interpretations. In theory, you're probably like, well, shouldn't this come earlier or whatever? I think this is most relevant in spec debate, actually. I find that in every other debate of like topicality, the judge is almost always going to default to competing interpretations unless you concede reasonability. But in spec, I think there's a great set of arguments that indicate reasonability is the only way to evaluate spec. So reasonability says that interpretation should be evaluated through reasonability. It isn't about whether a robot thinks one interp is slightly better. It's about whether the other team could have reasonably engaged under the other interpretation. Competing interpretation says robot's good. Interpretation should be evaluated strictly on the flow, and any marginal benefit to one interp rises to the level of a decision being awarded, right? So if ours is 0.1% better, that's still a reason to vote for us. That doesn't make a ton of sense to me from like a proven abuse standpoint, but that's how competing interpretations gets flowed, essentially. So what is sort of the core set of arguments people make for why competing interpretations is necessary or good? What is it that they say is bad if we don't do competing interpretations? It's a term I'm sure all of you have heard.
Judge intervention.
Judge intervention. Now, judge intervention can be bad, for sure, right? Like, but the way this gets explained in every debate is so stupid. But like, well, that means if your judge is racist, then like now because you said reasonability, they could be racist and vote me down. The premise being that like there's some dude in like a Klansman robe in the back of the round who, because you said competing interpretations, is like, damn it, now I can't vote down that person of color. I have to stick to the flow now, right? Like I'm only racist within reason. Doesn't make any sense, right? But there are obviously instances where it's like, I think sort of better explanations are like, people will say, I have no idea what you think is reasonable, so it's like arbitrary and I can't evaluate it. I think that's true. I think there's obviously a set of arguments for reasonability that's like, yeah, but like that's the judge's job. The judge has jurisdiction to decide these questions. That's literally what they're here for. And they don't necessarily need to do so on the basis of the flow. Concept number 9. Competing interpretations breaks down when it comes to spec because there's always some marginal benefit to further specification, i.e., the AF having to specify what color paper the bill was written on gives the negative more ground. That's a net benefit. However, that's stupid as shit and unreasonable, right? Like we have to draw the line somewhere. Spec is infinitely regressive, right? Because they can always ask us to do X, Y, Z thing further. Therefore, the judge should intervene and establish what is and is not reasonable. I think I have a slide on this somewhere, but like a classic example, like a block that DVC reads frequently when we read reasonability in like LD is if you thought the app was topical after the 1AC, it would be unreasonable for you to change your mind just because they read T. Like if you showed up to the debate and thought, yeah, that's what I expected them to say, then why wouldn't the negative also expect them to say that? Were we certainly operating within reason, yes or no? Last concept, concept 10. You don't need a bright line for reasonability but you definitely do need an explanation of how the judge can operationalize it via some form of judge instruction. So, is it good to have an interpretation for what is reasonable? Yes, I don't think it hurts, but I certainly don't think you necessarily need one, right? And you can instead just explain, like, here's how you do it. So that's what I was just talking about, right? Example, if you thought the app was reasonably specific after the 1AC, then you shouldn't vote on spec. That's not a bright line, really, because it's still up to the judge, but it seems pretty fair. Also, we're reasonable if we win a counter standard or defense on any of their standards. Okay, well, you provided a bright line. But the problem is, it's the same thing we talked about earlier where like teams think dispo means whatever they want. People will always say, like DVC even does this, like we're reasonable if we win defense on any standard or offense on any standard, or we meet, or like it's like if we do anything, we win. Like, you know? I think, and this is probably a Paul take and not like a necessarily a great actual debate take, but something to think about, just a set of arguments. I think when it comes to reasonability, it's how to explain this. Let me do the next slide and then I'll come back to this because I don't want to distract from the sort of actual building. Revamping reasonability. There is a lecture on DDI from I think it's Anthony Trufanoff, who's like a goat on this concept, but they argue that it's potentially useful to explain reasonability in a way that makes sense in a competing interpretation / flow-based evaluation. And one such way they argue can do this is to explain reasonability as a disadvantage to over-policing / constraining affirmative behavior. He discusses this through the concept of the law of lenity. The law of lenity basically is a principle in like legal theory that says if there are multiple interpretations of a given law, you should default to the one of the like defendant, essentially, right? Because the idea is there's possibly some like gray area legal behavior that is desirable and we want to encourage. And so if we were to over police in this instance by going with the harsher of the interpretations, that would discourage desirable activity. In the context of debate, what does this look like? There might be some really cool apps that are just outside of what the sort of assumed topical bounds are, that are very educational, that are in-depth, that are unique and creative. And we don't want to discourage teams from reading those if they're within reason and if they still allowed sufficient ground for the negative. Questions about this? Okay. So what I was going to say on the last slide, when it comes to reasonability, the way this kind of gets framed in a lot of discussions is like, you know, reasonability is inherently judge intervention. The flow is this objective, acoustic record of everything that was said in the debate. It's the truth or whatever. And I think that you should be willing to push back on some of that stuff, right? Like, obviously, judges are by and large not writing down word for word the arguments that were said, but instead how they understood them. And in addition, even through a competing interpretations framework, the judge is still making calls. Like, unless there's a drop, competing interpretations functions very similar to reasonability because you made an argument, they made an argument, and then the judge decides which of those arguments is resolved in whichever team's favor. Like, their job to a certain degree is to intervene and to impose their subjectivity onto their evaluation of the flow. Okay. That's that. I wanted to give some time for questions because I've been talking for like an hour and a half and we kind of rushed through some stuff because I want to make sure we got through everything. So questions about anything I said, anything to do with theory that was not said, just anything on theory.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
No, not for you.
Not okay. Yes, for me.
No.
Got it.
Yeah.
We're good.
What is like? How do you get better at coming up with counter interpretations that make sure you like solve your own offense? Is it just like a thing of just like reps?
I mean, it's certainly reps, but what it really is in theory, if you're the person who's answering a theory argument, you should know the kind of standards you want to read in general, right? Like everyone kind of has their back pocket standards, K education, creativity, et cetera, et cetera. And then you should filter your interpretation through that lens, right? It's the same way that you like kind of write apps, in my opinion, write disads. You want to sort of start with the impact and then figure out how do you get to that impact through like a topical action or something to that effect. And so you want to figure out what internal links you're hoping to garner and then write an interpretation that solves for that. So if you know you're going to say theory proliferation answers Condor or whatever, then you know you need an interpretation which solves for theory proliferation. If you know you're going to say field context, then you know you need an interp that is actually field contextual.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Other questions? Adrian?
What exactly is this argument? I've heard Berkeley read it before where they say to vote on the risk of a violation. What does that mean?
I don't think that means anything. I've had this discussion with Brenna. It's the same. To me, it's the same thing as being like vote on a risk of AF solvency. Here's the thing. The AF either has one that they solve or they haven't. You have either one that they violate your interpretation or they haven't. And so it's basically a like rhetorical sleight of hand argument that says like, usually this comes up in theory versus theory debate, right? So like Hondo and T debate, right? Where it's like, they definitely were conditional. There's guaranteed to be a violation because they were conditional in terms of they can't be, but there is some risk that we do meet their interpretation on T. But again, you either do meet or don't meet their interpretation. There's no such thing. Like similar, like when it comes to like a risk of pretty much a risk of anything in debate. Like this should just be probability analysis on the link that you did win. The only time that should ever be relevant is if basically if you're debating poorly or if you're both debating incredibly. And it's just like there's no clear outs for anyone, so we have to go for like some marginal risk of submission. Other questions?
How do you beat how do you justify that like your theory sheet or your T sheet or whatever
Comes before theirs.
Yeah, or like specifically like especially for a KF.
So I mean, I here's the thing. Definitely depends on your judge. I don't think that's particularly difficult at all from like a logical standpoint. I think that the sort of set of arguments that the negative wants to make when it comes to like framework versus topicality have a lot to do with that procedural fairness claim that we talked about, right? Most of the K answers to this are going to be about things that are external to debate.
In 1 second. Okay, dude. My bad.
It's all good. Most of the arguments are going to be about things that are external to debate. But basically, the way that Berkeley actually had a pretty good explanation of this for a long time that I've sort of liked, which is like letting them weigh the K against the theory sheet begs the question of whether it was legitimate or not, right? Like if we're right on this theory sheet that there is a violation and that hindered education and hindered our ability to clash, then all of the arguments that they're going to read on the K don't belong to the debate to begin with and should have been excluded. So you allowing those arguments to be weighed against theory doesn't really make a ton of sense. My judging philosophy like basically just says that. It says like I default to like T comes first unless you have a compelling explanation for why the K comes first. Now, obviously there are a set of K arguments, right? Which is like, yeah, but like these things aren't discussed in debate and potentially that matters more than the negative's right to engage, et cetera, et cetera. But basically all of those K explanations do come down to the thing we're talking about matters more than if the negative gets to be in the debate, which I think is a fairly difficult position to argue in many instances. But obviously, K debaters have been winning. I will note that in partly, honestly, K-AFs are not the move really in the meta currently, in my opinion. Like they haven't been super successful from things that I've been seeing. But, you know, it could be different. You could be the change you want to see in terms of that if you have a better set of arguments against it. When it comes to like theory versus theory, there's a lot of different approaches, right? But what tends to win out is like the order in which abuse occurred. I think of this like Yu-Gi-Oh! For those of you who don't know the rules of Yu-Gi-Oh! When you resolve a chain of like card actions in Yu-Gi-Oh! You resolve the last one first, right? And so the sort of question here is like, well, we were Kondo, but you were untopical. And the reason we had to be Kondo is because you being untopical hindered our ability to engage with you. And so we deviated our strategy such that we could compensate for that. I think that's fairly compelling. And I think it's harder to be like, no, condo comes first because like MG skew. It's like, well, LLC skew was logically prior to MG skew. You would have to argue that the degree of the MG skew was more significant, or that a skew didn't occur for the previous speech, which would basically just be winning that you were topical or whatever. Other questions? Jocelyn?
So I have a couple questions. The first is, I think this is probably specific to each round, but when do you think it would be advisable to collapse to like fairness over education and vice versa?
I personally think in like almost every instance, fairness is a better collapse than education, unless they just did a better job answering fairness, like somehow. Because I think the set of arguments for like procedural fairness tends to be very persuasive and like true to a certain degree. Now, some judges just think like get good, and if you have a get good judge, then you don't want to go for fairness. You want to go for education. Explain why your model is like better from that perspective, like pedagogically or whatever. The thing is, most like again, like Parley has been so bad over the years, and I don't know that this is true now, but it's like Berkeley used to like literally say like, if you want fairness, flip a coin, and that was an argument that would win debates. Or like, if you want education, you could just read a book. It's like these aren't arguments. These aren't arguments. They don't mean anything. They're not like doing whatever. And so in general, it is very much round around. Like you should look at what was answered and what was not answered. You should think of the most strategic collapse in the round. You should contextualize to your judge. But I would say, when in doubt, a fairness tends to be easier than education to win. And education is certainly harder to prove, like abuse on, essentially, right? Like there probably is education to be had from whatever interpretation is used in there.
Paul, could I add something to that one?
Mhm.
I think in my experience against KFs, education can sometimes be the easier collapse because they'll overcover fairness because I feel like that's easier to preempt, especially if it's not like a POMO K, if it has more of like a social justice element to it. It's much easier to have fairness related spikes in the 1AC as compared to education. And if you have a judge that is more of a K hack, or even a judge who you think would feel like uncomfortable making the decision of like what kind of fairness to prefer, education is a much cleaner out for them. And I think that like technically I do think fairness is a better impact than education, but because it tends to be so undercovered because fairness is generally like a better impact to go for, it can end up practically being the better out a lot of the time.
100%. I think that's completely right. I think that like basically, here's the thing: the situation where your opponent is reading a KF theoretically is the situation where your judge likes KFs or at least doesn't hate them. And in that situation, judges who like KFs are certainly more likely to vote on education than fairness, absent the team just kind of like screwing up massively. So yeah, that's totally valid. Go ahead, Sarah. Sarah?
Sorry,
Okay.
my bad. I couldn't find the unmute. People just like read IVIs or even RVIs and they'll just say like one or two sentences. But last year, Jojo talked about it all the time, and I think I'm representing him correctly, where he was like, it's just like any other argument. You have to have like different components of it, like a interp, a violation, standards, and voters. Like, how do you go about constructing that for like an IVI? Like, what would the standards be there?
Okay, that's good question. I don't think you should read IVIs or RVIs ever.
Okay.
I think they're in the category of spec where judges do not want to vote on them and will basically only vote on them if they're dropped. I think basically no RVI actually makes any sense. And like they're just overwhelmingly stupid. The only IVIs that make sense are like they said a slur, they like misgendered me or whatever.
Okay.
Like those clearly rise to the level of the judge informing their decision. But like they said we should lose because we read a KAP and that's unfair and uneducational. But actually, they should lose because Ks are educational, and they would stop us from reading them. It's like that's not a compelling argument at all. Like the T exists as a legitimate check back and constraint for like our ability to engage, right? T is not like a critique of you as an individual. It's a question of us guaranteeing we had access to XYZ arguments. And so I think almost all RBI arguments are sufficiently bad that they're just way easier to just answer and be like, that doesn't make any sense. Don't run on RBIs, they're stupid. Like, sure, you could say there's no uniqueness for this. You could say, like, if this is not an argument is at a minimum a claim and a warrant. This doesn't pass the sniff test, kind of whatever you want. I mean, Tony, do you have a different opinion on this? I genuinely think, like, in front of most judges, absent the sort of things we talked about, like people being bigoted, it's like impossible to win an RBI or IBI that isn't dropped.
Yeah, I think the answer to that would be like if you think it's a significant enough thing that you could win on it, you should just read a full theory shell.
Yes.
And if it's not, like you can read a sentence saying that it's an IVI or an RVI, but I wouldn't expect to be able to go for it. It's just a time suck.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Functionally, most RVIs or IVIs are just impact turns or link turns. And so, yes, in theory, they should have certain like elements to them when they're deployed that way. But I agree with Tanya. Like, if they did something that's actually so abusive that it rises to the level of a decision, why is this not a theory argument? Other questions? Okay, Tanya.
It can be helpful to think about like whether something is a worthwhile argument. Is like, could you elaborate on this for 8 minutes?
Yes.
Based off of the thing that you've read in whatever speech. And if the answer is no, it's probably not a position that's worth your time.
Yeah. I would say, here's the thing, folks. There's
exceptions.
Totally. I think something that you have to balance in debate, and you folks are in it, right? Like a lot of what I'm saying is like maybe theoretical or whatever, but like you folks are in it, so you have to get a feel for it. But the bottom line is minefield style arguments that you can only win if the other team doesn't answer them are bad arguments. They just are. They're by definition easy to respond to. However, the opportunity cost associated with reading them is incredibly low, and the benefit of if they go dropped is you basically win the debate. So I think you probably should have a few of those hidden somewhere in the shell, right? You should have these spikes that if they don't answer them, like just win the debate or whatever. But you should never collapse these arguments unless they're dropped. And I feel that same way about RBIs, which you probably shouldn't read in the first place. Other questions? Go ahead, Ben.
So I have a question about answering T. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes like we read like the 7 answers, right? And I think sometimes we just like read the 7 answers without like thinking about what we're reading. Yeah. And so like, what do you think we should be doing in terms of like identifying what the most important parts of the shell are? Or like, you know what I mean? Because I feel like often
I think the flow chart is this. 1, do you actually meet their interpretation? Because if you do, then you should focus heavily on that. If not, it's all standards. Like T is all standards, essentially. Like obviously you have to have a counter interpret to like engage on that level, but the T debate is 1 at the level of the standards debate almost always. Now, again, if they're interpreting the solve for stuff, there's something to be said there. But basically, you just need at least one offensive reason your interpretation is good and sort of defense or offense against their interpretation. The reason offense is so useful is even if you don't necessarily directly respond to their specific standards, which you probably should, you have something that can outweigh those standards, right? Which is good. You have like an offensive reason that there's just bad. Some people have done this thing now where like they flow like the answers to T on a different sheet, and like they like in the debate are like, we're gonna do our T sheet and their T sheet. And I don't know how much that makes sense. I would just answer their stuff right, like straight down. Essentially, the 6/7 answers is a framework. It is not a prescription, right? I'm not saying you need to do exactly that in that exact order every time. I'm saying if you don't do at least that, there's a solid hole in your strategy that would allow the other team to maybe win the debate. When I was answering T, it was just straight down the whole way, like every standard, let's answer all their stuff. And I would read as few counter standards as possible and instead just focus on why theirs are bad, whether
Okay, that makes sense because I'm used to, I guess, just reading the whole script, but I feel like sometimes, like, it's just like, if we're topical, like, I feel like just a we meet should suffice, but I feel like also some judges want more of the
100%. And again, the better you folks get, the more your judge matters. Like the more adapting to them and being able to sort of do those things that give you small advantages are going to win you more debates. And so if you are topical and like you're definitively topical, then yeah, it's enough to say we need, right? A classic example of where this went wrong There's a video, well, it's just an audio recording, but it is a video on my YouTube channel of me and Dallas in the NPTE debating against Max Grosnick and Will Harper from Texas Tech. And they read an interp that was like Southeast Asian countries means all Southeast Asian countries. That's it. That's the entire interp. That interp does not define Southeast Asian countries. It doesn't name a single Southeast Asian country. Our app, I think, was only in 2 countries. It was like Myanmar and Vietnam or something. And we intentionally did not, in cross-ex, ask them what the Southeast Asian countries were. So that come the MG, when I got to that theory shell, because they were like the fastest team in the country, I was like, on this, I'm just going to say one thing. Your interpretation is impossible to meet because it doesn't specify a single Southeast Asian country. No way to evaluate if there's a violation or not. Counter interpretation, the only Southeast Asian countries are Myanmar and Vietnam. Standards bright line. At least we have one. This was stupid. Thanks for wasting my time. For Zach Snyder, who was like a robot flower and national champion, all this stuff, that was enough. He was like, yeah, this is a stupid tea that they're just completely right about. For Zach Kui-Kendall, he's like, yeah, but I just don't buy that the only Southeast Asian countries are Myanmar and Vietnam. Which, fair enough, I guess. After that recording ends, it's like the 1JR, and I'm like, hey, totally understand the decision, not trying to change your mind. Zach Kui-Kendall, what countries do you think we had to defend to be topical? And he goes, I don't know, I just don't think you're topical. So, like, example of judge intervention being bad, like, whatever. But the bottom line is, like, if I was smarter or whatever, I could have spent another 10 seconds on that and probably guaranteed a 2-0 instead of a 1-1. So you got to know your judges, got to adapt. Other questions? We're kind of wrapping up here. Go ahead, Ben.
Oh, no, I was just going to say thank you.
Oh, sorry. Anyone else? Adrian?
I was going to ask about when we're prepping tea, is this supposed, or like, I guess it's going to vary on the topic. How much time should we spend like writing tea shells? How many? And like at what point during our neg prep should we be like writing these?
Okay, great question. Tea specifically, not framework tea. I think you should be spending basically 0 seconds writing tea. I think you should write tea interps, and you should be capable of doming the rest of the tea, right? Just like the same thing with like the MG when it comes to answering it. Now, if it's the NPTE, then obviously it's a whole different thing because you have so much time to prepare for it. But basically, I think you need to spend as much time as you need to find a field contextual interpretation that you think they won't need, and that's it. And then not spend 1 more second on top of it. Mostly it's going to be about understanding the like this versus this slides that we covered, right? Where it's like, am I going for this? Am I going for this? That doesn't need to be in the shell though. Anything else, folks?
Paul, can I talk? We can end the recording before I do this, but can I talk about Kondo real quick?
Yeah, 100%. You can talk about it on the recording. You're allowed to say whatever you want, unless you don't want to be on the recording.
It can be on the recording. I think I already made a video about this, so it would be repetitive. But I personally think Kondo is fine. People have different opinions. I would say that the big takeaway is like you do have to respond to a conditional counterplan different than other arguments. And the big thing is it's true that if you read a bunch of offense, they can get rid of it. But that's not true for theory, which is why you should always read counterplan theory, even if they aren't conditional. Or even if you don't ask the status, you forget to ask the status. That's why reading multiple theory shells on counterplans can be helpful because they can never kick that. And that's why focusing on the net benefit over the counterplan itself is probably preferable to spending time on like the counterplan text or whatever, reading a bunch of dissets to the counterplan alone. And I would say I do think Kondo is okay because I think counterplans are just really necessary arguments in the debate. And there's no other argument that is so easily like totally knocked out by defense, and which would automatically mean the neg would lose purely based on a defensive response from the affirmative. And I think that Kondo lowers the threshold a lot for reading counterplans, which I think is good for debate, which is my take on Kondo, but obviously lots of people have different takes.
Totally. And the thing, obviously we let our kids speak Kondo. And so obviously I want to be very clear. In LD and in honestly any evidentiary format, I think Kondo all day. I think like you're just a coward if you like say like Kondo bad for the most part. Like go ahead and do it strategically or whatever. But the thing is, like, obviously in those formats, you know what the app's going to say because they have to disclose, and most nags don't disclose, and so it totally makes sense for the negative. Like, you want to encourage the negative to engage in effective research on the specificities of affirmatives, right? And counterplans are a great way of them doing so. But like Tanya said, the opportunity cost is too high if you have to be unconditional. The reason I think in Parley Kondo is uniquely bad is because the topic changes every single round and you only have like 20 minutes to prepare. And so, like, obviously, for the affirmative, they don't have time to prepare meaningful second lines for their affirmative. They didn't really get to pick it to a meaningful extent either. You have like 2 seconds to pick your plan text. And so I think those are challenges. With that said, the only explanation I've ever really heard for Kondo in all formats that I think is very well, there's 2 really that are somewhat legitimate. The best one I think is murder boarding. For those of you who don't know, murder boarding is this concept that they do in certain industries, but the best example is like NASA, right? So at NASA, murder boarding is where when you're proposing an idea, we don't care if the responses to that idea are contradictory, if they're from different philosophies, if they like say the exact opposite thing, because if any of those things are right, the risk of us having done the wrong course of action is so great it would almost guarantee like someone dies or billions of dollars are lost or whatever. So in that context, it doesn't like any objection to the quote unquote affirmative is necessary and valid because the goal is to find the best possible thing that minimizes those extreme risks, right? And I think you can argue that like that's how we should think about debate and policy proposals, right? Like even though it's just like imaginary people or whatever, like lives are at stake with the kinds of decisions that we're discussing. And so like if a plan is bad because it's too left wing, or if a plan is bad because it's too right wing, it doesn't matter. It's still bad. Just because those things contradict each other doesn't mean that's not a legitimate thing. The second thing is just that like from a sort of big philosophical, pedagogical, game theory perspective or whatever, we impose a constraint on the affirmative that is the resolution, but there is no negative resolution. The negative does not have anything that binds them and that says they should be limited in their strategic options. And so why are you taking it away from them? In my mind, that again comes back to that question of format specific uniqueness, where in Parley, there's a big neg bias and so on and so forth. And so like that's why you're taking it away from them or whatever. I think this also is somewhat more compounded by the existence of like critical affirmatives, right? Where it's like, well, not only is there no negative resolution, but frequently the app pretends they don't have a resolution either. So why are we going to constrain the negative if like the app doesn't even have to abide by this thing? So like I definitely don't want to portray that like it's just so easy to win on Kondo. I think Dispo is a much easier set of arguments, and I think there's a very good set of arguments for Kondo in Parley. I think those arguments are much worse in any format with evidence, with disclosure, et cetera, et cetera. I have you know, I want this on the record, Proteus audience and people who are going to prep me next year at Nationals. I didn't vote on Kondo once this year. Not once. Not once did I vote on Kondo. Okay? How dare you? Anyway, any other questions before we wrap up? Because I got to be out of here in like 5 minutes. Cool. I'm going to stop the recording. Bye, Proteus and the internet. Wait, I didn't press stop recording. I pressed stop